Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you are having an amazing day. We have lots of news to get through in this video, but the bulk of it is going to be focused on the PlayStation 5 and VRS support, or variable rate shading. I'll be calling it, of course, VRS for brevity's sake in this video. There have been an awful lot of discussions online recently, many of which I've been tagged in, that the PlayStation 5 really does not have variable rate shading. The thing is about all of this is it's untrue. The PS5 does support variable rate shading, and we have several pieces of evidence that this is the case. For one, Shutter Munster, who is an art lead over at Activision, was speaking on NeoGAF. And, well, you can see what he said, if that makes sense, on the screen yourself. But basically stated that processes in the GE, geometry engine, happen before you even begin drawing, which is where VRS comes into play. See NVIDIA's Turing mesh shaders for a better idea of what's happening here. And then he also pushed the fact that for the next generation, of course, the SSD is going to open up a swathe of improvements. And of course, as we've discussed a lot of times on this channel, it's not just limited to, oh, I can load a level faster, or we can not need to worry about those walking and talking sections. It's also quite simply that you can stream in vast quantities of data. So this means that you can have much richer, more detailed worlds, you can have high resolution textures and you can stream those in as necessary, and it also means that you can traverse the world a lot faster and basically just removes a lot of limitations that currently exist with, of course, the mechanical slow drives we have now. And yeah, I think that the SSD is going to be a marvellous piece of technology for both consoles. But anyway, getting back to the PlayStation 5 and variable rate shading. Another reason we know that the PS5 has variable rate shading is because it also has foveated rendering. As a quick reminder of what foveated rendering is for virtual reality. It basically tracks the fovea in your eye, hence the name, and the purpose here is to reduce workloads on areas which are inside your, or outside, sorry, your peripheral vision, because if you're looking at something to the side, you can obviously see it in less detail compared to something that you're actually focused on. So this is an extension of that. So one confusion a lot of people have is that they say, well, the geometry engine removes the purpose of having variable rate shading. But that's kind of like me saying to you, well, you've got 2 feet, you don't need hands, right? It's kind of identical, because the two things are not actually doing the same job at all. I'm going to keep things really simple for this video, so if you're like a graphics programmer or something more advanced, I apologize for keeping things very simplistic, but I do want to make sure that as many people understand this as possible. Variable rate shading does pretty much what it says on the tin. The idea here is that it essentially adjusts the detail of shaded objects. So for example, texture details or processing of specific effects on the geometry. I've actually spoken a lot more about this in the DirectX 12 Ultimate video, so you can go ahead and check that out. It's very similar technology. It's part of the RDNA 2 feature set, but NVIDIA also have this available with Turing. And you can check out some games like Wolfenstein New Blood, which does actually employ a variant of variable rate shading. And obviously it does so with a performance benefit. Essentially, things which are, let's say, blurred because maybe camera blur is hitting it, or an object blur, which can be shaded with lower detail, or something that's quite far in the distance, or something that you really wouldn't be able to see with super fine detail anyway. It can be rendered, shaded, whatever you want to call it, at much lower levels of detail compared to something which is right up in your face. So, to use the same example as I provided in the DirectX 12 Ultimate video, if you're playing Wolfenstein, would you rather A, have lots of detail on the dog, which is trying to chomp your face off or burn you with a flamethrower, or B, have lots of detail in the object which is in the far background. Consoles have finite amounts of performance. The GPU can only handle a specific workload. This is whether you're talking about the Xbox, the PlayStation, and even the PC as well. Just because you've spent $1,000, for example, on a high-end card, it does not mean that you want to waste performance on something that you won't really ever see in-game. The visual difference is imperceptible. So, it's naturally better to either A, save the performance so that you can have a higher frame rate, or B, shade things which will be noticed by the player in greater visual detail. I've spoken more at length about the geometry engine in previous videos, so I'll link them in the video description, but once again, what it does is basically in the name of the thing itself, geometry. So obviously when you're creating a scene, it's rendered with a final output containing things like textures, lighting effects, particles, and all the other cool stuff that looks really pretty on screen, but ultimately underlying all of this is geometry itself. The geometry pipeline, well, the entire rendering pipeline is a very complicated subject, and I'm putting that extremely mildly. But in a nutshell, the further along you get to draw a specific object, the more resources you've wasted. So basically what you want to do is eliminate an object. You want to cull objects which will be invisible. For example, they fall outside of screen space, or they're obscured by another object, or what have you, as early as possible in the rendering process. Being as efficient as possible when it comes to the rendering pipeline means that the system itself has a lot more overhead where you can do more stuff. I said recently in another video regarding the PlayStation 5 that from what I understand, speaking to a few developers, one of the big complaints about the PlayStation 4 Pro is the fact that developers didn't really have as much control over certain aspects of the GPU as what they would really have liked to have had. And this is one of the reasons that the PS4 Pro was actually kind of noisy. I've heard that certain developers were complaining an awful lot that they didn't have as much fine-grained control over culling, and the entire process of the pipeline is what perhaps they'd have wanted, which is why the geometry engine is in place, so that developers can have that control. And now ultimately, of course, you can see yourself how both of these things, variable rate shading as well as the optimizations of what is actually drawn in terms of geometry, are as important as one another. It's not just a case of I want one, you want as much optimization during the rendering process as humanly possible. And this, of course, is much like the Xbox. The Xbox Series X employs various techniques for optimization. It has variable rate shading, once again, because of well, the fact that it's part of RDNA 2, I'll get more into that in just a second, and it also has mesh shading, which is extremely powerful. I've gone into this more extensively in the DirectX 12 video and a couple of other videos, but if you didn't watch those videos, long story short, it changes how the geometry pipeline is handled on the GPU. It basically handles it more like a compute shader, which basically just means it's a lot easier for the GPU to kind of wrap its head around what's going on. Now, once again, to go back to the variable rate shading and it being an underlying feature of the GPU, a lot of folks are getting confused because they are associating a feature with an API. Bear in mind that, for example, hardware-based ray tracing is supported with Kronos Group's Vulkan. I actually had a recent interview with Neil Trevitt from Kronos Group on the subject of hardware-based ray tracing, of course on Vulkan and lots of other stuff. Some stuff pertaining to the next generation console, but most of it, of course, specifically revolving around graphics in general. It was around 2 months ago. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. And he was going into this stuff quite extensively. It's a really fun interview, about an hour long. So if you've got some time to kill, then I'd of course encourage you to check it out. But long story short, a feature set of a GPU is not indicative to the API, it is part of the GPU architecture itself. So in short, just like on PC, you can have an NVIDIA GPU, like a Turing card, so let's say you've got an RTX 2080, then of course you can run a game using DirectX 12, DirectX 11, OpenGL, Vulkan, whatever, and feature sets can be exposed depending on the developer themselves. For example, you can run Wolfenstein using Vulkan or Doom on Vulkan, and Wolfenstein will of course support features like DLSS, it will support hardware-based ray tracing, but furthermore, you could run a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and you would also have support such as hardware-based ray tracing. And Vulkan, of course, can also do things like variable rate shading. Now, for the PlayStation, it does not use DirectX 12 Ultimate, it does not use DirectX. Instead, it uses PlayStation's own specific shader language. The family is known as PSSL, PlayStation Shader Language. And from what my understanding is, the PlayStation 5 is basically using a derivative of this. It's obviously enhanced and the feature set has been adjusted specifically for PS5 features. But long story short, I'll stick to the PS4 version here because it's better understood. But basically there are two versions of the API. There's a low-level API and a high-level API. GNMX is the higher-level API. This basically means that developers need to be less familiar with certain concepts of what the API is doing. Like, for example, memory management, which is a really big topic in computer graphics, is not completely handled, but largely handled by the API itself. So developers don't need to worry about crashing the console because they are mishandling a chunk of memory. It's a lot harder to make those kind of mistakes. And this obviously has the benefit of being faster to develop a game for, and also has the benefit of not needing so much complexity, but it also is less powerful. It allows you to get less performance out of the system. GNM, on the other hand, is the reverse. It's much lower level, really, like, pretty much addressing the GPU right down to the metal. It's as low level as possible because it's designed specifically for PlayStation hardware. And that, of course, allows the developer to do all manner of things, of course, as long as it's supported hardware-wise on the GPU, but the developer is also having lots of responsibilities thrust upon them. So, once again, they will need to better manage memory, they will need to make sure that they're being much more careful with their code. So, ultimately, that gives them the flexibility, and of course Microsoft with DirectX and the Xbox also have very much the same thing. They can code much lower level, or they can go to a higher level depending on what their needs are. Of course, with the current Xbox, it doesn't feature full support on the GPU for like DirectX 12 Ultimate features. It just doesn't. So of course, because of that, they don't get so much benefit kind of going super low level in that respect in terms of features, but what they do get, of course, is lots of additional efficiency because it's much lower level anyway. So they could do an awful lot more stuff, and obviously the overhead for the API is just less anyway, not least of which is because it's a console. So hopefully that does help clear a few things up, because as I mentioned, I don't know how many times I've been asked about variable rate shading on the PS5. So it does support VRS, and yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's clear enough in this video. As usual, thanks to everyone who has been asking me about this stuff, but I think that pretty much goes over the basics of how VRS is handled on the systems and why it's not API dependent. Instead, it's actually on the GPU itself. So, long story short, geometry engine equal for geometry, VRS equals shading stuff, and as long as it's supported in hardware, the API, of course, can just be written accordingly. So that's the too long didn't read version. I will finish off this topic with this. As someone who has sat in product briefings, and they have been hosted by marketing guys as well as even engineers who have worked on the product, they may decline to discuss certain feature sets. In fact, if you ask about it, they will basically totally and utterly brush it off and just say, at best, we're not ready to discuss that yet, or we'll come back to that, or something along those lines. And that's if you ask about it directly, because, well, they are either not ready to talk about it because there's NDAs in place, or maybe they have other talking points that they feel is more important. They basically are trying to control a specific message. Now, I do think that Road to PS5 was not necessarily handled the best. I think that even Microsoft didn't necessarily reveal the Xbox Series X perfectly, but I think they've possibly handled it from a PR standpoint better than what Sony have. I think that the Road to PS5 event, a lot of people went in with totally unrealistic expectations and were kind of expecting lots of gameplay and all of this other stuff, and obviously that was not the purpose of it. It was definitely an event which was more designed to woo developers, and that's why a lot of the technical features were more the things that were specific to the PlayStation 5. That's why we learned so much about the geometry engine and the Tempest engine and all of this other stuff. So once again, just because a feature is not discussed, it does not mean that it is not present. I am also pretty damn certain that there's a lot of features for both consoles that neither Microsoft or Sony have discussed. And to be abundantly clear, I am not just talking about features on the GPU or the APU, I'm also referring to features which will enhance your game. There is a couple of other small things I would like to discuss, mostly because they interest me rather than the fact that they're super technical. One of which concerns Resident Evil 4, and it's getting a remake apparently. This information has originated on the website Video Game Chronicle, so of course I'll link them in the description of the video. And allegedly, the original director of Resident Evil 4, Shinji Mikami, who of course has since gone on to do other work, including The Evil Within. I actually really liked Evil Within. I think Evil Within 2 may be slightly better. Let me know what your thoughts are on Evil Within. I thought it was a bit underrated. I quite liked it. Anyway, he was originally approached apparently, but he turned down the job. And instead what he did is provide informal advice to the development leads. So from what we understand, the development team is instead going to be M-2, which is a studio which was founded by Platinum Games boss Tatsuya Minami. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. I'm really sorry if I butchered that. But anyway, the game allegedly is going to be released in 2022. So not too long in the distant future. And I'm actually, I said this on Twitter, but I'm kind of like torn emotionally about this, because yay Resident Evil 4, which I really loved, but I don't... Controversial opinion time. I really liked Resident Evil 4. I thought it was really fun. It was kind of like a campy B-movie with ridiculous voice acting and cheesiness, but it didn't go completely and utterly overboard. It was kind of just right. The gameplay I thought was pretty damn solid. The only thing I didn't like about it is I did think it was a bit too actiony. That was definitely kind of the start of the series becoming too actiony for me. And I really liked the older versions of Resident Evil because of that. Like I just recently completed Resident Evil 3 Remake, which I thought was really good, other than a little short. I don't think that's a surprising opinion of mine. I think most people would agree. It was maybe about an hour to 2 hours too short, at least in my opinion. And a couple of areas, I won't spoil anything for the video because I know the game's still quite new. But I think a couple of areas were a bit, okay, I'm kind of looking forward to this to be done. This is kind of getting a bit boring now. But overall, I think the game was fantastic. I think Resident Evil 3 was really well done. So I had actually really hoped for Resident Evil Code Veronica, which I've actually been recently replaying on emulator. I'm playing the PS2 version on emulator because, quite frankly, I cannot be bothered to set up my PS2. Yeah, I'm really enjoying Resident Evil 2. Well, actually I was, and now I'm playing Final Fantasy. But Yeah, so I really like the game, Code Veronica, and I would really like to have seen that, because I think that that's aged a lot more in terms of the gameplay. Obviously, it's still got the tank controls and stuff like that, and Resident Evil 4, I know it's a really old game. I actually imported it from the United States. Obviously, I live in the UK currently, and I actually imported the US version of Resident Evil 4 to play as early as humanly possible, because I was really looking forward to the game. I think, though, I would have personally preferred Code Veronica, or the other option, of course, would be Dino Crisis. I'd really have loved to have seen a Dino Crisis. And the last thing I'd like to finish this video off, well, that's kind of a redundant statement, last thing to finish the video off, and that is rumours that Crysis is receiving a remaster. Remake or remaster, who knows, and this could be based on new CryEngine technology. As you would probably imagine, this would be absolutely phenomenal, given, of course, the next generation consoles will soon be released, but also we have ridiculous performing computer hardware compared to Crysis when it was originally launched back in the day. And Crysis even now can bring a lot of systems to its knees, mostly because of optimization problems. The engine which was used back then really wasn't that great at handling lots and lots of hardware threads on the CPU, and of course didn't also fully make use of a lot of GPU technology. So it's kind of difficult to imagine that even a remaster would look incredible, but maybe not actually super duper demanding, or at least as demanding as when Crysis first launched, because Crysis is an incredible game. Like, even if you look at it now, considering just how old Crysis 1 actually is, the game was released in late 2007, which is actually a little bit older than what I thought. I had to Google that because I was going to say 2008, so geez, that is pretty damn old. And back then, of course, systems were in this really weird period where they were becoming increasingly multi-threaded, and GPUs, of course, were a fraction as powerful as what we have now. So I think having a game like Crysis, which would have ray tracing, which would really just be a massive open playfield, which is essentially what it is. I would also be totally down for a Far Cry 1 remaster or a remake. I think Far Cry 1 would be as good in some ways, because obviously it's more survival based, although it does kind of jump the shark in the latter part where it becomes all about monsters, and I usually kind of stop the game about that point, to be honest. But I think Crysis 1 would be an amazing remaster. It's still aged fairly well, but imagine just being able to sneak around the jungle, having such an open world, but with super fast SSD technology, being able to stream in data, and just the vast richness that this kind of loading speed would be able to afford. Plus, of course, you've got just a lot of data now, but you've got way more RAM than back then, so you'd have an incredible richness, a diverse ecosystem that you could kind of traipse around in, but just the ability to hunt and stalk enemy soldiers by better being able to understand their position with awesome 3D audio, and being able to understand where they are based on things like dynamic shadow. Oh my goodness, it would be pretty damn amazing, at least in my opinion. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Normal stuff if you did. Like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.